The first Resident Evil game is my favourite. There is just something about that mansion setting that creeps me out in a way the police station in Resident Evil 2 just couldn't do as well, although the mean streets of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis were fun for a lark. But give me the mansion setting to play through any day of the week, no matter what version it is. But out of all the versions of the first game to play, my favourite is the Saturn port. Now I know this isn't the best version of this game to play, but it does have its charm, and there is no greater feeling of satisfaction than being able to play through the first, or even the first 4 games in this series on Sega consoles. And even though I'd pick up the Saturn version to play any day of the week, the Nintendo DS port is a close second, so for this year's Halloween special I'll be reviewing Resident Evil Deadly Silence for the Nintendo DS. For all those uninitiated with this horror classic, we better go over this game's premise. A series of cannibalistic murders have happened on the outskirts of Raccoon City. Now, strangely enough, this city has a department located in the RDP to deal with situations like this called STARS, Special Tactics and Rescue Service. For this mission, STARS is split into 2 groups, and Bravo Team is sent in first, but all contact is soon lost with them, and so it's up to Alpha Team to find and rescue Bravo Team. All Alpha Team manages to find is the compatriots down helicopter and a pack of killer zombie dogs. With Alpha Team being chased by those zombie dogs, they have no choice but to take refuge in a nearby mansion. But who builds a mansion in the middle of nowhere? Umbrella, of course! Oh, I could go on beyond the story setup, but I would be spoiling something special for you. This is a game we need to turn the lights off, go in with no expectations, and be able to lose yourself in the kind of horror that's topped off with loads of cheesy dialogue.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Throughout this game you can expect more of that excellently cheesy dialogue, but story and cheesy dialogue aside, let's get to the meat of the original game before we talk about how awesome the DS port is. The name of the game is survival horror, which means you get spooked and then you have to survive that very spook, and if you manage to survive that, then you might live long enough to find items, which you then have to manage, and also solve the odd occasional puzzle. I know describing the game in this way kinda makes it sound simple, but it really isn't. You are loosely given direction in what you're meant to be doing, but to be honest, you might as well have been dropped into a mansion in the middle of nowhere and told, just figure it out. This is what I love about the early Resident Evil games, because you have to do lots of exploring to figure out what's going on and what you need to do. There is just something scary about slowly easing your way into new areas to make sure the coast is clear before you press on. Just because you have weapons and ammo for those weapons doesn't mean you can kill everything in sight. You still have to be resourceful and pick the appropriate weapon for the situation, and all the while trying to find ways to conserve ammo and health. If you mismanage or use up your ammo and health, then it's game over. And if you hadn't recently used an ink ribbon with a typewriter to save your game, then you're really screwed, as you've got lots of backtracking to do. And that is the original Resident Evil in a nutshell. Now, as much as I love this game to bits, it is severely dated by today's standards, which is why in 2002 it was remade for the GameCube. Now, this is an excellent remake that still holds up today and will soon be getting a HD remaster. But the GameCube remake had an advantage over the DS port in that it was remade from the ground up. The DS port, on the other hand, is not a remake but a port, and it's this port's job to be faithful to the original game, as well as try to be accommodating to new players. And just because it's a classic doesn't mean you can't improve upon it. Resident Evil Deadly Silence shows off some improved 3D graphics, although it can be hard to see them at times on the smaller screens and lower screen resolutions, but nonetheless the visual improvements are there. I like that Capcom managed to improve the 3D graphics while also still retaining their classic look and feel from the original game. The pre-rendered backgrounds, despite being heavily compressed and at slightly low resolution, are still just as chillin' as ever. But a word of warning, if you're playing this game through means other than using a Nintendo DS, then expect excessive pixelization. This isn't a fault of the game as it was designed for the Nintendo DS. But there is a huge advantage to this game being on a Nintendo DS, and that is the second screen is used for the map. With the original game, you had to keep going back into the menu to see the map, which was so time consuming. This one change is single-handedly the best feature of this port, as it saves you constantly having to go back into the menu to look at the map. Something else that's a time saver is that FMVs, in-game cutscenes, and even door opening sequences can all be skipped, which saves you an enormous amount of time. And that's time that could be better spent, I don't know, how about enjoying this awesome port? Now, I wouldn't recommend anyone new to this game to skip all these bits, as they're part of this game's experience. But if you're a vet like me who's played this game a million times, then you'll just want to skip straight to the action. And on the action side of things, this port also incorporates features from later Resident Evil games like the 180-degree turn from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and the quick reload and knife attack from Resident Evil 4. The 180-degree turn is always a welcome feature in any Resident Evil game, as it allows you to get out of dodge much quicker. And the quick reload is a massive time saver, as you can quickly reload instead of having to wait until you're empty to auto reload, or repeatedly having to go into the menu to combine ammo with your weapon of choice to fully load it. But why waste ammo when you can knife your enemies to death? With Deadly Silence, you no longer need to have the knife in your inventory to use it, as it's mapped to your controller layout. This means you can use the knife throughout the game without it taking up an item slot. This one change totally changes the game, as it keeps the knife in play. With the original game, you would just put the knife in the chest right away to save an item slot, which I always thought totally defeated the point in having it in the first place. But with Deadly Silence, if you see a zombie on the floor, then just knife him to save some ammo. Or if you're being tight with the ammo, then you can kill some of the enemies in this game with just a knife. If the knife is used effectively, then you can save a ton of ammo, and having a stash of ammo is always helpful in these types of games. If you played the original game to death and feel this port might not have anything new to offer you, then you are sadly mistaken. Rebirth mode isn't just the same game again with tacked on DS features, it's like playing through an entirely different game. So if you went into this port thinking, I know Resident Evil, this will be a breeze, then you're in for a rude awakening. Enemy placements have changed, so you now never know what's behind each door, and that makes this classic once again scary. Also, Rebirth mode loves to screw with you at every chance it gets, so always be on your toes. Just about every puzzle in Rebirth mode has been reworked to make use of the DS's unique features. I did get a kick out of these puzzles, although I couldn't stand the Master of Knifing sections, but we'll cover that in a bit. So far so good, right? Yes it is, but this game does have issues. Now these issues aren't necessarily failings in the original game's design or in the way it was ported to the DS, but there are two things you have to remember with Deadly Silence. First thing, this is a Nintendo DS game and has to primarily function as a piece of software for the system, and second, despite this game's tweaks and new features added, this is still a game from 1996. If you loved the first Resident Evil game, then you'll still dig this Nintendo DS re-release. But if you hated the first Resident Evil game, or any game in the series that feature tank controls, then this port won't win you over. I've never had any issues with tank controls, but I do understand why horror games had to move away from them.
No! Don't go!
For anyone who doesn't know about tank controls, then just imagine your character is basically a walking tank. Forward moves you forward, and pressing right or left while standing or moving allows you to move in any of those directions. But always remember, wherever your character is facing, no matter where yours or his perspective is, up on a D-pad is always forward. And that's where I suspect most people just give up trying to master the tank controls, as they can be disorientating. This criticism about tank controls isn't really a negative, but more pointing out a limitation in that this port will mostly be enjoyed by long-time fans of the series, rather than the casual crowd the Nintendo DS managed to attract. This game's DS features feel tacked on, but Capcom were kinda painted into a corner as they didn't have much of a choice but to add them. You see, with the Nintendo DS, the unwritten rule was you had to at least make use out of 2 of the 3 unique features of the DS. I give Deadly Silence credit in that it managed to make use out of all 3 of the DS's unique features. As you already know, this game does make use of both screens, with the top one being used for the map. The touchscreen is used for navigating in-game menus, solving puzzles, and is also used for the knife stages in Rebirth mode. I can't stand these stages for one simple reason. The Nintendo DS touchscreen is simply not responsive enough. The only way to do a successful slash is to do it a moment just before you need to, but these stages just blow. Something else that blew in the original game was having to backtrack to one of the save rooms to grab Richard some anti-serum. In Rebirth mode, he's not poisoned, but dead, and so you have to blow into the mic to resuscitate him. Do I really need to point out how unoriginal this is, when loads of Nintendo DS games have already done this before? I've never had any of the first few Resident Evil games crash on me, but what do you know, I indeed experienced a crash midway through my first attempt at Jill's Rebirth mode, but maybe this was just a one-off thing. So after reloading my game, thanks to the crash, I also start to notice some other things. Like for example, whenever there's lots of activity, things start to slow down. This didn't ruin the experience for me, but considering how undemanding this port is on the DS hardware, there shouldn't have been any slowdown. While again the DS is no powerhouse, it should have been more than capable of producing graphics with little to no slowdown. A good example of what the DS could do is Dementium: The Ward. Now, this is an excellent horror game that is way more graphically demanding than Deadly Silence, and also manages to keep a steady frame rate throughout the game. So again, I ask, why is there any slowdown in Deadly Silence? I also noticed loads of glitching throughout the game. Funny how Jill moves around without moving her back foot. Or when you walk into a fallen zombie, it moves with you. I'm surprised these glitches made it all the way through to the final product, but to be honest, I'd rather have these few issues than deal with patches and updates. Other than its few complaints, Resident Evil Deadly Silence is overall an excellent port that will give fans of the series another opportunity to play this classic on the move. Or if you're like me, you'd rather play this at home with the larger but less portable Nintendo DSi XL. I know doing that kind of defeats the point of this port, but what the heck, it's Halloween. And speaking of Halloween, before I bid you farewell to go trick-or-treating or to your Halloween parties, there's still some history to cover before I can finally wrap up this review. Resident Evil Deadly Silence was not the first, second or even the third attempt to port a Resident Evil game onto a portable system. The first was in fact a GBC port of the original game that was cancelled sometime in 1999. From a technical standpoint, this port is an incredible achievement, as it is as close to a Resident Evil experience as you're ever going to get on the GBC. This port also proved that with clever programming, the Game Boy Color could handle sprite scaling, a feat previously thought impossible. But despite this port's technical achievements, Capcom still weren't happy with it, and decided it was for the best to just cancel it. I love how Capcom of yesteryear would put the quality of their games before everything. It's kinda sad what Capcom has become now. The second attempt at a portable Resident Evil game was an unofficial port of the second game by Raylight Studios. This port was made to put the studio on the map and show what they could do. Nothing the studio did was done with Capcom's permission, which is why this tech demo was never finished. If you have a GBA flashcard, or even an emulator, then you can play through this port yourself in about 5 minutes. If nothing else, this tech demo is an interesting gaming oddity. The third attempt at a portable Resident Evil game was in fact another port of Resident Evil 2, but this port was strangely finished and released on the ill-fated Gamecom. Why Capcom thought this monochrome port would be a good idea will always baffle me. And finally, in 2006, Resident Evil Deadly Silence was released. This port was made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the original game, and this was the first DS game to be rated mature. There wasn't a whole lot of mature rated games on the DS, but Resident Evil Deadly Silence holds the proud honour of being the first. If you love the first Resident Evil game to bits and want any excuse to play it again, then you can't go wrong with this port. Yes, I know some of the DS features feel tacked on, and the game feels a bit buggy, but the core Resident Evil experience is here, and that alone is worth the asking price. And it's in this regard why Resident Evil Deadly Silence succeeds, because it was made first and foremost for fans of the original game. So grab yourself a mug of your favourite Halloween beverage and dive into this portable classic. Oh, that's good. Stay safe as Halloween season, and as always, thank you for watching.